All right, let's jump right in. You know that feeling, right? That pressure to make your life story fit into this neat, perfect line from point A to point B. But let's be real, our lives aren't like that at all. They're messy, they're complicated, sometimes they're totally contradictory. And that's exactly the tension we're going to unpack today. So, I've got a question for you, a direct one. When you really think about it, is your life one coherent story? You know, a neat little package with a clear beginning, a middle, and an end? Yeah, for most of us, that's a tough one to answer. It's complicated, isn't it?
And that's because a lot of the time, life feels more like this, a whole collection of competing truths. We've got all these different roles we play, these past versions of ourselves, these experiences that just don't seem to fit together, all of them kind of jostling for the spotlight. And this is a core idea from the philosopher Ajit K. Maan, that maybe, just maybe, the goal isn't to cram everything into one single box. But for a long, long time, the big answer to this problem of a messy life was, well, to do exactly that, to force it all into a single story. So let's take a look at the classic solution, which comes from the really influential philosopher Paul Ricoeur. So Ricoeur's big idea was something called narrative identity, and it's actually pretty straightforward. He said that we create our sense of self by basically becoming the authors of our own lives. Think about it. You take all the random, chaotic, disconnected stuff that happens to you and you weave it together into a story, a coherent plot. You're the main character, and your life is the novel.
Okay, and this is where it gets really interesting, because Ricoeur actually breaks identity into two different types. On the one hand, you've got item identity. Think of this as your sameness, the things about you that stay consistent, your basic character traits. It's the stuff that just is, it's unintentional. But then there's ipse identity. This is all about selfhood. It's who you are because you make promises and you keep them, even as you grow and change. This is intentional consistency. And narrative identity? Well, that's supposed to be the bridge that connects these two sides of you. So how do you actually build that bridge? Well, Ricoeur has a special term for it, emplotment. It's kind of like a three-step process. First, you start with all the raw material, life's messy, chaotic, disconnected events. Then, you step into the role of narrator. You gather up all those pieces and you shape them into a structured plot, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And voila, what comes out of that process is a unified identity, a self that finally makes sense because you've created a story that makes sense. I mean, this all sounds pretty great, right? A neat, tidy way to make sense of who we are. But there's a catch. There's a real cost to demanding this kind of perfect, unified story. And that's where we hit the central critique of this whole model. Who gets left out? What parts of our lives get erased when we try to create that one single story? Yeah, let's be real for a second. Not everyone's life fits into that neat, tidy, straight-line plot. So you have to ask, whose stories just don't fit? Who gets pushed to the margins by this ideal? In this quote, man, it just hits the nail on the head. For a lot of people, this whole Western idea of a unified story requires too much experiential negation. What does that mean? It means that you have to deny or just erase huge parts of what you've actually been through to make your story fit. You're literally cutting away the pieces of yourself that don't fit the neat and tidy plot. And guess which stories most often get left on the cutting room floor? The ones from the margins. You see, narratives that come from women or from people with cross-cultural backgrounds, they often get labeled as formless or incoherent. Why? Because they're often fragmentary. They jump around in time. They have multiple voices. They actually embrace the chaos of life instead of trying to force a simple order on it. So here's the really crucial point. Forcing yourself into a single story isn't just an artistic choice. It's a psychological one. It becomes what Ajit Maan calls a homogenizing operation, a fancy way of saying it smooths everything out, makes it all the same. It forces us to push down, to repress, all the parts of ourselves and our memories that just don't fit the main plot. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the solution? What's the alternative? What if, instead of trying to patch up all the cracks and fault lines in our life story, we actually found our identity inside them? Well, this is exactly where Ajit Maan introduces a really powerful new way of thinking. And she calls it inter-narrative identity. The idea here is that a coherent self isn't built from a single, unified story. No, it's built from the connections between all our different competing, even contradictory stories. So instead of seeing those breaks and ruptures in your life as a problem you need to fix, this model says, hey, that's where the good stuff is. That's the source of who you are. And to make this less abstract, Malarian gives us a fantastic real-world example, the memoir Fault Lines by the author Mina Alexander. I mean, the title alone kind of says it all, doesn't it? Alexander talks about being a woman who was, in her words, cracked by multiple migrations. Think about it. She moved between India, Sudan, England, America. Her life was just too fractured to be told as one simple, straight story. She says it herself. Her life did not fall into the narratives I had been taught to honor. It couldn't just be this neat circle that closes back on itself. Okay, so this really lays out the difference perfectly. Let's look at the goals. For Requer, the goal is unity, wholeness. For Mahjong, it's coherence, but through multiplicity. Now, how do you get there? Well, Requer's process is about synthesizing and, yeah, sometimes repressing things, but Mahjong's is all about associating and affirming all the different parts. And the structure? Requer is all about that linear plot, right? But the internarrative model is way more flexible. It's built on space, place, and memory. So what's the big takeaway here? What does this actually mean for you and me? Because this isn't just some dusty old philosophical debate. This is about taking back the power to choose how you tell your own story. Now, let's be super clear about something. The point here isn't to just throw structure out the window. This is not a call for total chaos, where your story is just a jumbled mess of events. No, structure is still absolutely crucial for making meaning. The real point, the big idea, is to expand our choices of structures. It's about having what McClellan calls narrative agency. And that's just a powerful way of saying you have the freedom to choose the shape of your story, not just what goes in it. You don't have to squeeze your big, complex, messy life into a one-size-fits-all story. And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. Just for a second, think about all the little pieces of your life, the experiences, the parts of you that you've kind of edited out just to make your official story work. Now, what if you didn't have to? What new connections, what hidden strengths, what incredible new meanings could you discover if you gave yourself permission to tell your story not as a straight line, but as a rich, complex, and beautiful map of everywhere you've been?